Chance Dorland, and this is In-Depth, an interview program from ExpressNews.com with in-depth reporting and other resources for stories affecting San Antonio and Bexar County. Last fall, Express News data reporter Luke Whyte began data-driven investigation on the wage theft of migrant workers. That series, called Ripped Off, continues now into 2019, and I'm joined by its author to discuss findings that affect San Antonio, Texas, and areas across the United States. So, Luke, thank you for joining me here on the In-Depth podcast today. Let's start with your first reporting of this Ripped Off series that began last fall. I'm wondering what the impetus was to start this research that went into the theft of migrants' wages.
It started by accruing Department of Labor wage and hour division investigation data, which is basically any time that anyone makes a complaint with the federal government that they haven't been paid minimum wage, they haven't been paid all the hours they worked, or they weren't paid overtime, the DOL can choose from one of those complaints to open an investigation. So it started by analyzing this data on a meta level to see if there were trends geographically. Are there areas where there are considerably more investigations, or are there specific companies or specific industries where there have been a lot of investigations? And that sort of drilled us down into the Rio Grande Valley.
So yeah, we'll get into a lot more of those details. And if there's anything that piques your interest during this conversation, there's a lot more at expressnews.com where, Luke, you've worked on countless interactive web pieces that demonstrate just how much data has been put into your investigative series. During our conversation today, I'd like to try to weave as much of that data together as possible to get a clear picture of all the different variables that are at play here. Let's start at the bottom of this chain, if you will, with the discussion of how migrants get into the United States, then follow them to where they find employment, these federal investigations into wage theft, and then finally legal repercussions for employers who have been found guilty of things like wage theft and worker abuse. From the information that I've seen, Luke, while there are many places to come across the border, of course, most migrant workers come through three areas, as you pointed out, one of which is in Texas.
Yeah, that's correct. Particularly with migrant farm workers, there's a consensus that there's three streams, like you mentioned, one which moves through Florida, one through California, and the largest one is through Texas's Rio Grande Valley. Traditionally, the eastern stream, as they call it, migrant stream, would be workers who come from a more of a Caribbean origin into Florida, and then will sort of work the eastern seaboard throughout the harvest season. So they follow the summer, so to speak. They start with harvests down in Florida, then up through Georgia, Mississippi, through the Carolinas, and up all the way to New York. And then there's a similar pattern with the two other streams too. So the central or Midwestern stream is migrants who come across through Texas. Then they'll move with the harvest season up throughout the Midwestern part of the United States, harvesting corn or whatever else it is that needs to be hand-picked. And then similar in the California side. Though, like you mentioned, the Texas stream is considered the largest because though it predominantly covers the Midwest, it's the access point frequently for the Eastern and the California streams too, because a lot of migrants will come through Texas and then move east or west.
And so, Luke, given that there are these three main entry points or streams, as you've called them, for migrant labor, it doesn't really come as a surprise that those three areas, Florida, California, and Texas, have some of the highest concentrations of farm labor contractors per county. So tell me more about these specific areas and how that compares with the rest of the county. You've already pointed out how people that come through Texas, they may end up going higher to the Midwest, or they may go west to California or east to Florida. How does all this work?
The structure of the system is pretty complicated, but like one of the agricultural industries, particularly in this harvest aspect of it, has become very decentralized. So there's not really one company that's growing the crops and then hiring people to cultivate them and then hiring people to harvest them and then to deliver them. It's become very sort of uh, decentralized into different smaller entities. So the way that it works primarily is, I guess you could start at the bottom. You have your farm worker, your migrant farm worker who comes across looking for work. He links up with what's called a farm labor contractor, which is an independent contractor who is registered with the Department of Labor. They have to be registered because there was a lot of issues in the 1960s with the way they were treating workers. So they've sort of put these laws in place to attempt to filter out bad contractors. The contractor hires the workers and then will maintain relationships both with the workers that he wants to try and hire and then also with the farms who he builds contracts with to conduct their harvests throughout the season. So he'll then take his workers he's hired and move them throughout the country following the harvests and harvesting the produce.
So that's a good point. So not only are there these three main streams, and then you might go to somewhere in the area where you cross, or you might go to a different part of the country, you'll then follow the work.
Yes. And so farm labor contractors frequently, the tools of the trade for them are the capacity to speak both English and Spanish, and then some way to be able to transport workers. So if you're a local farm labor contractor, if you just work in one region, that might just be a pickup truck or a couple of pickup trucks and a couple of friends. You drive around, you pick up workers, you get them and you get supplies for working supplies to the fields. However, on these sort of larger scale migrant farm operations, the contractors often have school buses, old school buses that they've sort of repurposed, and they'll move the workers around the country. The workers will then stay in worker housing at the fields where the harvests are being conducted, which vary greatly in terms of their level of quality of living. That's all supposed to be regulated by the federal government, and it is, but resources are really tight. So a lot of times places and slip through the gaps.
So speaking of regulation, you talked about how some of that data was really what got this whole series started last fall. Some data that I've seen that is from all the different work that you've done that's up at expressnews.com. It looks like from 2008 to 2018, the number of agricultural industry investigations by the Department of Labor really do kind of mirror those three highest areas of concentration for farm labor contractors. I'm wondering how these investigations get initiated and kind of what the process is. Are these migrants who are saying they're being treated unfairly? Are these other people in the industry who are noticing things are off? I'm wondering, it's probably a mixture of both of those cases.
Yeah, it's a mixture of that and also investigations that are initiated by the Department of Labor themselves. So it's largely agreed upon that the DOL is understaffed for the task that they've been set out to complete. So, there are thousands, arguably millions of wage and hour violations each year, and only a small number of investigators who are actually hired to go out and look into what these complaints are and see if back wages or back wages are due or other violations have taken place. For that reason, the DOL has to be conservative in what it decides to investigate. So, though an investigation can come from a specific, farm worker or worker in any industry making a complaint, it often takes more than that. It'll take several workers coming together to complain, or several complaints over a period of time that sort of, eventually sort of bends the DOL's ear, or in industries that are notorious for wage theft violations, like the agricultural industry. In that case, often the DOL will initiate investigations on their own accord, which they have done quite a bit in the Rio Grande Valley.
So you've highlighted some legal cases against employers for not handing out wages to migrants, also for employing unauthorized migrants during the course of your investigation for this data-driven series, Ripped Off. I'm wondering if you could highlight some of those cases. What types of violations are you seeing?
Well, Immigrant workers, particularly those that are undocumented, are the often the most at risk for these sort of wage theft violations because they're in a position where they're vulnerable, right? So if you have sort of a predatory employer, they can take advantage of that worker easily. And often what they'll do is they'll threaten them with like, well, look, if you don't accept how much money that I'm willing to pay you, and if you don't keep coming to work when I tell you to come to work, I'll call immigration, or any of the other number of threats you can make against someone who doesn't really have a normal legal status in this country. And though this plays out in a variety of industries, there tend to be a few where that are sort of like hotbeds for issues of wage theft with migrant workers. The agricultural industry is one of those. The restaurant industry across the country is definitely a hotspot, and the domestic worker industry, I think, is a real problem. And then a few sort of other manual labor industries. So, with that in mind, some of the cases that we've focused on have been in so far in the agricultural industry and the restaurant industry. There was a particular case here in the Rio Grande Valley that we looked at last year, which was with two workers who had been working with a small barbecue chicken restaurant called Pollos Medina, and they had been working upwards of 80 hours a week for as little as $3 to $4 an hour once it was averaged out. And they were also subjected to a lot of verbal and, in one case, pretty severe physical abuse by the employer. There were threats to call immigration, and lots of other sort of psychological abuse that compelled them to stay at the job. Ultimately, they ended up winning that lawsuit for a judgment that I don't have the exact number at the moment, but it was a little over $1 million. The majority of which, though, has not been paid out to the workers because of the various attempts to hide and mask their money by their previous employers.
You've pointed out a lot of really good reasons why, if you're in that type of situation, like what you've just described, it would be really important for you to get paid your full amount. But something else, specifically when talking about migrant labor, many migrant families live below the poverty line, and that's something else that you've covered.
Yes. Yeah, I think oftentimes because of the type of work I mean, not all migrant laborers are undocumented, but with those that are, the type of work opportunities that are presented to you are, often under the table, and one of the repercussions of that is very low pay, sometimes illegally low levels of pay, which is what we've been looking into. And it can be very, very difficult for a family that's sort of living in the shadows of the system to try and rise up above the poverty line, because they're sort of operating in a clandestine fashion, which is very difficult.
You've already mentioned a local case, but I'm wondering specifically what else you can say when it comes to how San Antonio compares to other areas of Texas. And then, of course, a lot of the data that's up on expressnews.com now that you're responsible for really talks about the rest of the country as well when it comes to wage theft and other abuses of migrant workers. Does San Antonio and the area around it stand out for one reason or another?
Texas definitely does, and San Antonio, in certain industries, has a high number of cases. We're a little bit of a standout in construction cases, but nothing really, really significant. The further south you go in Texas into the Rio Grande Valley is where you see really, really high numbers, and that's not just centered with the undocumented population. I think it's an issue for the whole valley, and it's hard to pin one point as the reason for that, but there's definitely a culture down there that seems to cultivate these sort of predatory employer-employee relationships. But that being said, wage theft does happen across the country and across all industries. And though we're focusing mostly for our investigation on undocumented and lower wage workers, wage theft happens to people at all areas of the economy. I think one area we see it a lot in recent years is with young college graduates who will take contract positions with large corporate companies for extended periods of time, where really they should be considered an employee of that company with all the benefits that comes with that. But the company takes advantage of the fact that they need the work.
So, Luke, as we speak for today's episode, your latest installment of the Ripped Off series is now available at expressnews.com. What did you cover for your most recent story?
For our most recent story, we looked at a case of wage theft and labor trafficking in the agricultural industry. We focused on a worker who had come from Mexico. He was recruited in Mexico to come across the Rio Grande River into Texas, where he then met up with some farm labor contractors who took him to Florida to begin working on the eastern seaboard migrant farm worker circuit there. Because of the nature of the relationship with his employer, employer had agreed to pay his coyote fees to get across the border into the United States. And the farm labor contractor had told the subject of our story that he could pay off the debts to his coyote fees once he arrived in the United States through the agricultural work he would be doing for him. Of course, that proved impossible as the contractor paid him far less than minimum wage, withheld wages for random reasons, didn't give him an accurate account of how much debt he actually owed. And the worker found that once he arrived at the first labor camp in Florida, he was living in squalid conditions in this housing with cockroaches that were running through the floor, lots of mice. I think something like 20 men living in a single bedroom apartment, or I can't, I'm not sure if that's exactly accurate, but the conditions were very, very cramped. Lots of workers living in a space that was run down and not big enough for all of them. And then they were forced to pay rent on that place, even for days that they didn't work, because when you're harvesting fruits and vegetables, you don't work every single day. And so it became that the worker, and there's the subject of our story, but there were also 20 or so other workers in the same circumstance, are not able to pay off their debt over time. They don't know exactly how much they owe to the contractor. And in that sense, they become almost modern day indentured servants, in the sense that they're never able to fully pay off their debt to their employer. This particular farm labor contractor, there were other abuses that the workers suffered. He frequently kept a gun with him in the fields while the workers were harvesting crops. They weren't allowed to stop. There were no breaks. They're working straight 8 to 10 hours in over 100-degree temperatures. Workers on occasion would collapse. They were threatened when they stopped working with the gun. The contractor would also walk through the fields. He would take target shots at birds and trees to threaten the workers. When he did pay them, he always had the gun across his lap, just as sort of a sign of intimidation. You're going to get what I give you. And this relationship continued throughout the Eastern Seaboard as he moved workers from Florida up to Georgia and Mississippi, finally all the way up to New York, where there were some volunteers for a church group who were affiliated with a workers' rights center, who started sort of getting a whiff that something was really, really wrong here. And slowly they began to discover the depth of exploitation that was at place here, and began a plan and process to extract the indebted workers from the situation.
Well, Luke, if half of those details that you just mentioned now are in that story, that's got to be quite a read. So that's available right now at expressnews.com. I'm going to let you go, Luke, but I want to give you time for final thoughts, maybe food for thought here for the remaining moments we have left on today's episode. Is there anything that you've run across that really points to how this situation could get better? I know when you first talked about investigations, one thing that stuck out of my mind was that the government really just kind of had to pick and choose choose where it was going to investigate because, like with a lot of things with the U.S. government, they just don't have unlimited resources.
Yeah, that's definitely what I would hit on. When you talk to when you talk to anyone, if you talk to people who work for the Department of Labor, if you talk to activists, you talk to attorneys, everyone will say that there are laws in place to stop these sort of things from happening. There are laws to protect workers' rights. There's also specific laws to protect farm laborers because of issues we've had over the years, over the 20th century. And the problem is not that the law needs to change for the most part. For the most part, the problem is that we need to enforce the law better. And we can't do that because there isn't the money or the staffing to do that at both the federal and the state level.
And thank you to San Antonio Express News data reporter Luke Whyte for joining me for today's episode of the In-Depth Podcast, an interview program from expressnews.com. For the San Antonio Express News, I'm Chance Dorland.